Wonderful. Well, thank you for that. Tell you a little bit about me, but if you do have the chat window up, guys, there is a little welcome message there. I'm looking for you to introduce yourself in the chat if you fancy being social, who you are, where you are in the world, and Yob, how Yob, birth of your now 3-month-old second daughter. We're going to have to get my 3-month-old son and your 3-month-old daughter together at some point. So I think that's a pretty good one. So today we're here to talk about 5 things that you didn't know about xAPI that will change your life. So no small ask. I think we're working on the assumption that xAPI hasn't yet changed your life too many times. Otherwise, these 5 things might not be incredibly original for you. But hopefully you'll be able to pick at least 1 or 2 things out that you didn't know before. I'm going to kick off and talk about a few things that I've seen over the last 12 or 18 months that have come to reshape the way I think about xAPI. And whilst I'm talking, Hytham's going to be looking at the chat and the questions. So if you've got anything that you want to bring up there, maybe he'll reply on the text or he'll interrupt me and bring it up. And then later on, for the last 2, the crescendo, as you will, I'm going to hand it over to Hytham, and he's going to take the final 2 things that you didn't know about xAPI. If you do have questions or comments throughout, then please do put them in the chat box and we'll do our best to take them. We should have some time towards the end of the presentation when you can fill that in. A brief bit about me. My name is Ben Betts. I'm the chief exec here at a company called HT2 Labs, and we partner with Kineo and the City and Guilds Group. And in principle, one of those key things that we're partnering around is around learning data and analytics. So we make a tool called Learning Locker, which is an open source learning record store, and we've been involved in xAPI for a few years now. So I've got a reasonable amount of experience implementing xAPI in the real world, and today's sort of examples will mostly come from some of the thoughts and realizations we've had of having worked with xAPI over the last little period. So welcome to everybody. The webinar is being recorded, and I'm sure Kelsey will make it very amply available to you and all of your friends and family who will wish to watch it back later this evening, probably. So the first thing, we promised you 5 things today, so there will be lots of slides that say which thing we're talking about. The first thing we're going to talk about today is about connecting data without xAPI. So at the top of the show, I said 5 things you didn't know about xAPI, and the first thing I'm going to talk about is not xAPI. A lot of the time when we have conversations with clients or with prospective adopters of the xAPI ecosystem, that what we sort of see is that they have acquired a lot of learning technology over the years. Like, we're not falling short when it comes to the number of tools that exist in our organizations. Where we are falling short is the ad hoc nature in how that's kind of evolved. And so we end up with performance systems and learning systems. The company acquires somebody, we get another LMS. We don't like the LMS, we get a third LMS, then the exam platform, the e-portfolio, the path thing, the journeys, the content management, the LCMS, the webinar tool. All of these things come in and drive us crazy because collectively it makes sense. You can see how an ecosystem could evolve. But over time, things have become deeply messy. And all of these systems have evolved in this kind of piecemeal ad hoc manner if you're not careful or have been very deliberate about it. So when I first came to think about xAPI or Tin Can as it was called back when it was a prototype a few years ago, then what I was thinking about was a way in which I could connect all of these systems together and have a single source of data. That was kind of the dream when we came to make our learning record store, Learning Locker. But the problem that I kind of came to in this was I was waiting for all of these systems to become xAPI ready. It was kind of like, you know, Storyline did a little bit. It wasn't perfect, but at least they're doing something. And then this LMS was trying to do something and that LMS was trying, and it was kind of slow, and it kind of has been a little bit slow. And the realization becomes that actually, if I wait for the world to do xAPI, I'm going to be waiting for quite a long time. A lot of systems, either they don't do xAPI because it doesn't necessarily concern them, or they won't ever do xAPI because they have other means of getting the data. When we're talking about xAPI, all we're talking about is a document. It is a specification that says this is how you can talk about experiences that happen in one system, store them in a database, and maybe learn about them on another system. So we're just connecting data between systems using a shared language. That's all xAPI does. It's not necessarily about the tech, it's just the semantics of how we talk, this actor, verb, object thing that we've got going on. And there's lots on the net, so I'm not going to dig into like the basics of xAPI. There's lots on the net you can find. There's a blog we put out yesterday on the Kineo website and give you some of that background. But I was kind of waiting for the world to become xAPI, to all do this. But the bottom line is there are so many systems that exist in my organization, and they don't necessarily need to do xAPI for me to start gathering data. So we started thinking about gathering data in 3 different ways. First of all, we thought about, I'm going to use my fancy little pen tool here. Check this out. Oh yeah, look at that. You know, there are some tools that we can do with xAPI because it comes xAPI ready. So if you've got a Moodle or a Tatara LMS, for example, then you can install the Logstore xAPI plugin, and that will transform all of Moodle's output, all of Tatara's output into xAPI just natively. It will just do it. So in this case, this is super easy because the data just flows in and it flows down here into my learning record store. But then if you really want to start talking about how learning is impacting on performance or how an ecosystem of tools can come together, you end up having conversations that say, well, look, actually, we've got Yammer. And actually, there's a whole lot of social stuff going on Yammer here. How can we transform that into xAPI? And I mean, I don't know if you guys use Yammer, but if you ring them up and say, hi, can I ask when xAPI is on your roadmap? I mean, no one's going to answer that question. You've got no chance. And quite right, Yammer has developed its own application programming interface that works for all of its customers, not just the customers that use it in learning. And we're only really interested in xAPI because it helps us in the learning and development department talk about things that matter to us. It helps us talk about things like results or tutors or platforms, things that really we care about, perhaps other people in other departments in other sectors don't. So something like Yammer or Salesforce or Slack is never going to adopt xAPI because they're more generic than learning. They cross a much wider boundary than that. But what they do provide is a well-documented API, not the xAPI, but an API of their own devising. And given that it's in a broadly correct format, that somebody did something, triggers an event, we can translate this. We can put it through a transformation process and put it into Learning Locker or whatever learning record store you happen to have. We do this with what we call integration pipelines. So these are transformations that we program and that take data straight out of an API like Yammer, transform it into what we call an xAPI recipe, the sort of the nuts and bolts of the language we use with a statement, and places it into the learning record store. You can have a look at open tools like Zapier. So Zapier, open as in you can go get it, it's not open source. Zapier and if this, then that. There's lots of tools that are emerging in the automation space that will take data from one system and transform it into another system. We at HT2 Labs program our own pipelines. So we use a service from Google to actually help us put those pipelines together. And it's not that difficult to do. But you can use publicly available things like Zapier, like if this, then that, to start triggering automation techniques that say, if somebody has a conversation in Yammer, can we transform it? Can we put it into xAPI language and store it in a learning record store? The final point is that some of these systems that we have, maybe my legacy LMS down here, it doesn't even have an API. So you're coming to it and saying, hey guys, can we see the API, something to do? And they say, nah, we haven't got an API, or not one that you guys can access, not one for the likes of you. But what most programs have is some ability to get at data in an activity type form. So they can get you maybe a CSV, some sort of log, an Excel file of what happened. And even that we can transform using those same pipeline techniques. Because if I've got a spreadsheet, then I can transform those rows and columns into xAPI. So let me show you what I mean. I am a big fan of the Michael Lewis book Moneyball, subsequently the film, obviously Brad Pitt being my favorite. And anyway, if you've ever read the book or seen the film, it's all about how we can use data in baseball to game the system and gain an advantage. So inspired by Scotty Hatterberg and the Michael Lewis book Moneyball, I went onto ESPN and I downloaded a whole bunch of Major League Baseball data. So I got every home run hit towards the tail end of last season, in an Excel spreadsheet. And, you know, this is kind of format that you might see in a bunch of different things. You got the date, you got the hitter, the team they were playing for, who the pitcher was, the pitching team, what innings it was, what ballpark it was, and so on and so forth. Now, this data is just coming straight out of ESPN. I've done a little bit of cleaning with it, but not a lot. But you can almost see that this is almost getting towards a bit of an xAPI statement. I can see that maybe Matt Adams did something. He hit Xavier Sampson. So that's pretty much a statement right there. You can have the object at the end being another person, an agent, as we call it. So Matt hitting Xavier sounds aggressive, but in the baseball example, that's entirely logical for an xAPI statement to be made out of this sort of data. And I can append all of this other stuff, the pitching team, the innings, the ballpark, as part of the context that goes with an xAPI statement. So if I build a little script that can take this data in a standard format and transform it into a given template, then I can get data from pretty much anywhere into xAPI, and that's what I did. So, you know, Matt Adams here hitting Xavier Sampson. Then when I actually dig into it a little bit, you start to see some of this detail, what innings it was, what ballpark he was in, what the pitching team, what the hitting team was. All of that is very straightforward. It's just transformation of data. Folks in other industries have been doing this for years. And so I guess my number one thing on today's 5 things that I wanted to talk to you about was how can we get data when not everybody's going to come to the party and get xAPI natively. I'm telling you that's not a problem, and it's to be expected. Most systems won't do this out of the box. And even those that do, sometimes you might wish they didn't because you want to change the verb, the context, some of the extensions. So if you actually have a process by which you can transform or alter this data, get it into the right recipe, into the right format, that becomes really quite powerful. And that's how we do things consistently here at HT2 Labs, is we're taking data not just from xAPI sources, but from tools that have application programming interfaces or CSV downloads. It's not a barrier to have to wait for somebody to become xAPI conformant. So thing number 1, you can connect data without xAPI. You don't have to wait for it. Thing number 2 is that your data doesn't just have to be about activities. Because increasingly, one of the things that we're seeing is increasingly relevant is not just data about activities, but it's about demographics, about the person that we're talking about. And some of that's to do with the management of identity, and some of it's because I want to know what department somebody's in, what function they're in, what country they're in. And these are things that kind of change with time, and they're not necessarily really strictly activity data. Yeah, okay, I might have been in the learning department when I did this, so I could record it as xAPI. But if you've ever looked at the specification, xAPI is immutable. You can't change it. So if that changes down the line, then I have to keep some record of every department I've ever been in. It's not a particularly conducive use of using data in this way. And there's also a fundamental problem with this kind of layout, the actor, the verb, the object. You'll have heard this bit before. Ben watched Jurassic Park. But the reality of these ecosystems that I talked about in thing number 1 is that we end up with all sorts of mess when it comes to identity. It's not always as straightforward as Ben did this, because my actual identifier is an email address, or maybe a different email address, or maybe an account ID, a unique ID, a single sign-on ID. So somebody can perform pretty much the same action and be the exact same person. And we end up with 2 different statements. And this becomes a real problem for us, trying to reconcile when somebody's doing something across one of these more complex ecosystems. We have to work out a way in which we can merge these together. Now, xAPI actually has a number of different API elements to it. And one of them does allow us to talk about this. It allows us to think about agent profiles, to give multiple identifiers to the same person. And so if I click into my learning locker, this is difficult to see on this screen, so I apologize. But the principle here is that I can have multiple identifiers for the same person. So when I have my record here, which is Alan Betts, you can't quite see that, I apologize, then I can store lots of different data about Alan Betts. I can store not only his account ID, so here we go, here's an account ID that I stored for Alan before, and that came off his Fitbit. So I was tracking one of Alan's wearables. That's a really good example, by the way, of an API being transformed into xAPI. Fitbit doesn't do xAPI, but it's got lots of data, and we can transform it in real time using Zapier or something like that. So every time somebody's taken 100 steps, we can upload that data into a learning record store. But I've also got these other identifiers for him down here. Here's a whole different identifier that's also for Alan Bett. Now, using a learning record store, you can reconcile these into one thing. So we can reconcile these different identifiers into a single persona, into a single agent profile. And this means that I can query just Alan Betts in one place and return all the sets of data that correspond to any of his identities. In really clever systems, you can do it using business rules, which get to about 75–80% accuracy. So they can be done automatically. Others you have to manually reconcile, but the principle is still there. It doesn't necessarily matter that you have multiple identifiers for the same person. What matters is that you can reconcile them and then query on one persona, one agent profile to bring it back together. The other thing you can do here is you can add other data. So you don't just have to think about somebody's name, somebody's email address, somebody's unique identifier. You can add lots of other data alongside it. So I went into my Major League Baseball because I got some other stats as well. You know, I want to know where they were born. I want to know how much they weigh. I want to know how tall they are. All of these sorts of things are all pieces of data that I can store in a learning record store. It doesn't have to be the xAPI data, the activity that I'm only referencing. And with these two sets of data, I've got activity on one hand and I've got demographics on the other. I can start giving you analysis on which state is the most productive, how heavy you have to be to hit the furthest home runs, whether height matters. All of these things are the sorts of statistics that I can do once you can start merging things together. So it's not really just about that idea of having one Ben watched Jurassic Park. We can actually merge all of those identities into a single persona without having to go to all the faff of doing it manually. A couple of questions that I'm going to just ask, we'll go from there. JG, your question just got answered. Can you not require a single ID for each user to avoid this? Yeah, you absolutely can. And obviously that would be best practice. But what we often find is that there's some third-party piece of data, maybe something that comes in from a web form, maybe you're trying to collect survey results or something like that. There tends to be one or two edge cases that just sit slightly outside. And at that point, you're kind of like, okay, well, how can I deal with this? So it doesn't have to be a count out. Certainly, if you're going through things and you're thinking, what's a good fit for my ecosystem? Single sign-on would be top of that list. But it doesn't have to be the game end if that's not the case. Nick Jones, doesn't Ben then become your identifier? Do you have to make Ben part unique? No, because the Ben part's just my display name in this case. The actual unique part will be assigned from the learning record store at this point, and it will be made up of all the other identities that sit within it. So there's a difference in a lot of the things we talk about with xAPI between a display name, something that I or you might read, and what's actually the unique identifier that sits behind this. So in Learning Locker, I can't necessarily speak to other learning record stores here. In Learning Locker, every time we see a new person, they get a new persona identifier that sits behind the screen, and that combines all of them together. It doesn't necessarily mean it's those end-to-end. You're going to get a new UUID issued by Learning Locker, and it's going to comprise those other ones that are there. And you get a display name that will come as part of that. I'm just going to take a little scroll back up these questions whilst I'm here. If there's any that I should have shouted out, anything that we've seen? No, just Craig's life being changed by a vacuum cleaner, which, you know, is interesting for all of us. Gary Golden, your thoughts on structuring LOS data views. Is graph analytics node relationship format, is it possible, desirable to see the LOS data in pathway node formats? I mean, Gary, it depends on your hypothesis on the question you're trying to answer. My theory on how you would visualize some of this, and forgive me, I'm just taking a minor detour for a minute, is that reporting is kind of the visible edge of the iceberg when it comes to what a learning record store can do. The most obvious thing that you can do with a learning record store is some form of reporting, and that could be tabular. It could be in a relationship, something that's kind of an X versus Y relationship that you're trying to inspect a correlation or something like that on. Those are the most interesting for trying to spot patterns. Certainly, you can do the same with bar graphs, with column graphs, with pie charts. But reporting is itself kind of the visible end, the obvious end of things. To go beyond that, you need to go a little bit deeper into pattern recognition, maybe taking data out of a learning record store into an analytics package, trying to do something with R, trying to do some best fit regression analysis and things like that. Because otherwise you're just being very reactive. Reporting will tell you what has happened, but it won't give you the opportunity to necessarily intervene before it's happened. You're just reporting on the past. So for me, this next bit where we're going to go, the third thing we're going to talk about, predicting the future, is actually where the vision goes at that point. So yeah, reporting is important. But beyond reporting, we should be thinking about how can we go through reporting into analysis and into modeling, going through that sort of routine. So forgive me, Gary, for using your question as a bounce into my third bit, but I talk about this journey that people need to go on. To begin with, most organizations need to just connect systems together. The exact first thing we talked about, thinking about the ecosystem of many things going on. How the heck can we just get these systems talking to each other to have a single source of record? That's the thing that most organizations are trying to do right now. And it's a good starting point. Beyond that, there's going to be some analysis. And some of it's going to involve some graphing. Maybe it'll involve some relationship stuff. Maybe you'll be getting to a place where you can look at the statistical significance of a relationship. Does X cause Y? Do people commenting on Yammer close more deals? Do people completing this course get a better average transaction value? All of those things can be visualized, but they are kind of reactive. You have to do the analysis first before you can understand the potential relationships. But given that you understand potential relationships between variables, then you can start to build models that say, hey, I believe people who will take this training, who make these comments, who do these things, will go on to have a better transaction value, to engage more, to retain more, to stay in the organization more. And that's where this stuff gets really interesting, because now we're moving from being reactive, reporting, into the proactive world of maybe being able to take some action before something occurs. So we've seen this time and time again where we do things in a slightly more educational setting, perhaps. It's been something that's been on the radar of educators for years. Its transition into learning technologies in the corporate world has been a little bit slower. But for example, here's just a quadrant taken from a City and Guilds example that maybe a tutor would see as they were trying to understand which of their students in a particular cohort needed the most coaching. So anybody who's up here in this top right quadrant is fine. They're on track. We've got no problems with them. But according to the models that we've developed previously, so from previous data, we've seen that people who don't necessarily engage very well become a bit of a performance risk, or don't necessarily progress well, become a bit of an engagement risk, or that people who fail to progress and fail to engage are actually at risk of completing or failing to complete this exercise or this routine. In education, it's quite straightforward because the task is to actually gain insight to get to the end of the curriculum. In learning technologies in the corporate world, you have to be more subtle because this stuff can really influence people's ability to continue in their role. But given this data, isn't it better to know that actually, as a tutor, if I've got 10 people in my class, I know that these guys in the bottom left-hand corner need my attention the most. And I can start to think about a more personalized course of action to help them out. This is the sort of stuff that gets me excited, that I think will change the life of what we do. And we talk a lot about performance support and things like that in learning technologies world, but it's not often you see it happening. Same example again, but in deeper, one of our largest clients, JISC, they represent R&D here in the UK for higher education. What they call non-continuation, what you and I call dropping out, costs £300 million a year in lost tuition fees. And so this is what they do. They come up with things like this based on the data that comes out of xAPI. So they gather data from a VLE, from a Moodle, from a Blackboard. They gather it from the library. They gather it from attendance, when people literally swipe in, swipe out of rooms. And they gather it from the student information system, some of that demographic stuff. And they put it all into a learning record store. And then they make it available to third-party predictive analytics tools. So here's a company called Tribal. They make something called Student Insight, which is able to give live predictions as to whether a person is likely to drop out of a course or not. In this case, this guy's going steeply downhill and is very, very happy about it. So maybe we need a different picture for him, some sort of emoticon that shows how he's going. But the bottom line is now a tutor can take proactive action to try and save this person from dropping out. Not everyone will be saved, and saved is probably a totally inappropriate word. Some people are in the wrong place doing the wrong thing. They should leave. but others just need help. And I think that's quite exciting because this sort of level of prediction, which is present in education right now, but not seen very often in the learning technology world, is starting to come. And it changes everything about the stance of a learning and development department for me. Because now, you're not going to measure compliance risk training completions. Right now, we're doing a lot of, did 100% of people do the compliance training? Oh, yeah, they passed it. Yeah, they did that. Forget that. What if we built a model that said these risky behaviors coupled with this lack of training equals risk? And then actually, I can deliver you at the C-suite a KPI, a leg at the table that holds that up. So it's not just a seat at the table, it's a fundamental point that holds the C-suite table up to say, I can play into your risk prediction because I know that people who do X and Y go on to do Z. Now that takes time. That's not something you're going to do overnight. So when we talk about this sort of stuff, you know, I go back up here to my diagram here, things I didn't necessarily point out, but look, down this axis, time, at this axis, data. You need time and you need data for your models to be proven correct, because otherwise you can come up with a theory that will never actually be proven to hold any real water in the real world. But that's why it's so important you have to start today connecting systems. Because if you want to do this in the future, if you want to predict risk, or if you want to measure staff satisfaction to look at retention, if you want to stop doing training needs analysis because you want to anticipate demand, you have to be building these sorts of models. And to build those sorts of models, you've got to have data, you've got to have time, you have to connect the systems together, and you have to perform learning analytics to make it happen. So the third thing was a big one, predicting the future. I've seen it done quite often in education. I've not yet seen it done very well in learning technologies in the corporate space. But I really do believe that this has to be one of the reasons that people start adopting xAPI, because you want to get data in a standard format that will allow you to create models and to go forward and do this sort of prediction work in the future. Just going to take a little moment to reflect back on some of the chat here, because I've been talking like a mad person for a little bit here. Sam, how do you collate all of the identities together into a single persona if there's not a unique identifier per identity? Is that manual or have I missed anything? So it goes back to my earlier point. The LRS will create a unique identity, something that starts off as some sort of unique ID, and then it will append one of those identities to it. So if it's the first time we've seen Hytham put data into the learning record store, it's going to go back through the list and say, hey, have we seen Hytham@Kineo.com arrive in this learning record store yet? No, we haven't? Okay, create a new persona. That persona's got some unique ID that's, 26 characters long, unrecognizable, but appended to that 26 character long one is Hytham@Kineo.com. And then next time we come along with another piece of data that says, hey, we've got Hytham Gassam here, but he's got a different email address. Then you can either enter a reconciliation period where the LRS flags it up and says, hey, this might be the same person. Sometimes you can do it automatically with business rules to be able to say, look, if the person has the same display name and a similar email address and one or two of these other characteristics, it's probably the same person. Merge the identities together, and then we can go back and review if it's wrong. Or you can do it the other way. So you can either moderate retrospectively or proactively, depending on which way you come forward. But fundamentally, the first time something comes into the learning record store, it's looking at all the records it's already got and suggesting whether that person has been seen before or not. And if not, creating them a new persona. Mel talking about pulling data out, visualizing it. Yeah, absolutely. You're definitely going to want to be able to get to some of this deeper analysis. You're going to want to use some tools, maybe a Tableau or Power BI or Looker or something like that. So getting it out to BI tools is important. At the very least, you want to be able to export to a CSV or Excel, but getting a data connector that will push it between the two is the kind of gold standard at that point. Then there was another one, Matt Fuller. Does an LRS just take or can it give pass to an LMS, for example? Yeah, it definitely it does both. So go all the way back up to one of my earlier slides, which I didn't get to the other side of. Here's my wonderful drawing here. You'll see that it's going out of this in this direction as well. So there's a number of places that data will come out of a learning record store. So one of those could be one of those BI connectors, getting it into Tableau. One of those could be a native dashboard, something in the learning record store. Some of it could be business rules. We call those journeys in Learning Locker. And so journeys are kind of an internal if this, then that. So whilst I talked about Zapier and if this then that on this end at the API end. You can also do the same in the learning record store to say, hey, if this statement and this statement and this statement arrives, then make that happen. And that's really useful for not only pushing things to other systems, but also to an LMS or completions or something like that. That's something that you can definitely do in that sort of space. Scrolling down. Why do we still call it a learning record store, says Job? I don't know. I mean, it was the name that was given. It's quite a good name on some ways. To us at Learning Locker, learning record store is simply a bucket. So if we look in here, I actually call it a data warehouse in my graph here. So coming into more common analytics parlance, we're increasingly talking about the store as being a data warehouse. And that's especially relevant when we're taking data from APIs, CSVs, demographics. It's kind of munging the explanation of what a learning record store is. Strictly speaking, a learning record store is a very precise definition. It is a database that adheres to the xAPI specification. So what you're probably finding with most of the more advanced learning record stores on the market right now is they're pushing that definition, because not only will they comply to be an LRS, they'll do a lot more as well. So I think most of the products on the marketplace are probably becoming data warehouses or analytics engines or something like that. They just happen to have a learning record store component, and that component is responsible for their validation to make sure that data in is in the right format. Scrolling through some of these a little bit, Chris. Don't most LMS solutions have the ability to capture all this info, the records? In other words, why need an LMS separate from the LMS? You might have a better LMS than I have, but no, very rarely does an LMS allow you to capture things that in this sort of format and to this sort of depth. So one of the things that an LMS tends to do quite well is it can collect data about stuff that it knows in advance. So I upload the package of content, and then I can report back against the package of content. I create a learning activity, and then I can report back on the completion of that learning activity. What the LRS is really good for is for recording data on things you don't know are going to happen. So I don't know that somebody's going to have a conversation on Yammer, they're going to make a sale on Salesforce, or that they're going to bookmark a web page. So that's very hard for an LMS to kind of report against ad hoc stuff that's just occurring outside the context of the LMS. The LMS is generally very good at recording stuff that happens. So those ecosystems that I talked about right at the top of the show, a lot of our ecosystem stuff is happening outside the LMS, the informal world. So for me, the LMS is generally not great at recording stuff that goes on outside of itself. That means to me, it can't be the single point of record. It can't be the source of record. It can be a brilliant source of data, but it can't be the ultimate source, because it can't necessarily record data about all the informal stuff that goes on outside of the learning management system. So that's really where I'm coming from there, if that makes sense to you, Chris. It's kind of a little bit different. So I think I'm caught up, and I think I've talked too much. I'm going to kick back, take a sup of my ginger beer, and pass over to my good man Hytham, and see if you can tell me 2 more things that will change my life around xAPI.
Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Hytham Gassam. I'm Kineo US's Director of Technology. Ben talked about a few things that are will be helpful, from a learning perspective, employing the xAPI. Before I jump into the fourth thing, which is basically the ability to launch and access content anywhere, I just wanted to talk a little bit about SCORM. Obviously, we're all aware of SCORM and its limitations. SCORM is basically the shareable content object reference model. It's a standard that was set by ADL. There are a few limitations to using SCORM. I can talk about just give examples. One of them is, only a handful set of data items could be tracked and reported back to, for example, a learning platform. Basically, SCORM can track or report back on informal learning activities. So when Ben talked about usage of Slack and all the items that are outside the LMS, there's no way to be able to report that back into the LMS using SCORM. The third limitation, the third example of a limitation is SCORM can't easily track content objects hosted outside the learning platform, which is kind of related to the point before it. But what that means is with SCORM, the package needs to be part of the LMS. Obviously, there are provisions like AICC, the SCORM cloud, where you can actually host the package external to the LMS, but you need to provision means in the LMS to be able to consume it and get the data that you're looking for from the learning itself. I'm going to talk about a couple of examples on how you can possibly get around the issue of content not being in the LMS. So in this slide, it's just a pretty simple example of having or integrating a learning management system, a content management system with an LRS, and having all that data in the same place to be able to look at what was done in all the systems. On this end, you can see that this is the CMS. It's WordPress. And on the left-hand side, you'll see Moodle as the learning management system within that ecosystem. So through this structure here, we're able to basically launch courses from within the LMS that are not hosted within the LMS, which is the typical SCORM process when SCORM is to be accessed for learning. So we were able to host the content on WordPress. And once the content is launched, it gets sent, or the statements get built and sent to the LRS. On the learning management system side, there is a dashboard pulling data from the LRS back to an LMS or any kind of other platform. So there's a dashboard on the LMS that's pulling the reports from the LRS that in a stream format. So users, as they are taking learning, whether it's from the LMS or anywhere on the CMS, they're actually looking at what they're doing. So that's just another simple way of aggregating all the data together and being able to see it in one spot. On the CMS portion of the system, there are two activities that the learners can do. So they can basically look at an interactive video, and as they interact with the video, their statements of their interactions are being pushed to the LRS. They can also play a game, and the same thing will take place about pushing the statements. And back to the dashboard, they're actually seeing what's happening in the other system in WordPress on the LMS side of things. The one thing that is detrimental to this kind of infrastructure is single sign-on. So through an identity provider that satisfies both the LMS and the CMS, and acts as an identity place of record, basically. We're able to have the same identity for the learners. So as a learner, when I log in, regardless of where I'm doing the learning, I can see exactly what I did. And like I said, single sign-on is something that's detrimental to this structure here. Again, even if it's different identities, it's the same person. They have different logins, as Ben alluded to earlier. Just based on the business logic at the LRS level, we can always combine those. The next slide is basically a profile that's based on xAPI. It's referred to as CMI5. And CMI5, like I said, is just a profile. It's a set of rules that uses the xAPI, and it could be utilized to govern the communication between a learning management system and learning content. So in the previous example, we saw that we're actually hosting some of the learning outside the LMS. In this example, everything happens in the LMS except for the hosting of the assignable units, which is the content units, basically. What happens is there's a launching mechanism from within the LMS that will launch the units wherever they're hosted. They don't have to conform to the same launching mechanism. Each unit can be launched in a different way, so you can launch it on the same window, you can launch it on a different window, but you have a set of rules by which you are communicating with the LMS and the LRS. So there are so many other profiles that are based on xAPI. They are all available on the adl.net website. And basically, some examples, other examples are there's a video profile, there's an xAPI actual profile. You can, of course, look at those, but this is just another simple example of how you can actually host the LMS or host the content outside the LMS without having to conform, again, to the rules of scope. I'm just looking at the chat. There's a question. Are there any open source LMSs that implement CMI5? At this point, J. Pablo, there aren't. We're working on basically a plugin that will work with CMI5 and Moodle and Toja. So that's in the works at this point. So back to this example, through this structure or landscape, we're able to store content-specific data in the LRS, and obviously we can query that data back, when it needs to be looked at, reported on. The other advantage is, for example, if one of the content or the assignment units is waiting to consume data that's being tracked in another assignment unit, through CMI5, you can actually do that without doing a whole lot of customization. In the past, when there were dependencies between content units, these are the assignable units that I was talking about. But in the past, sorry, I don't have, my drawing skills is not as good as that. So, I think you get the idea. But that, process where you're actually, having dependencies in the system, that's something that, can be made possible through xAPI without a whole lot of customizations. So this is just a snapshot of a system, an ecosystem of learning. Ben talked a little bit about similar systems, but the one thing that the xAPI, through the ability to report on and launch content outside the LMS, you're actually able to, for example, collect data of learners that are performing, tasks, on social media sites. So what this does is it allows to basically build and enhance a distributed learning ecosystem with as many learning nodes. Um, in a nutshell, it basically covers the 70-20-10 model of learning. So you're not just tracking formal learning, you're also tracking informal events, like I said, things that happen or tasks that happen on social media sites. For example, reading ebooks, on the job training, if it's an activity that happens outside the LMS. Another example of being able to track items that happen outside the LMS is, for example, onboarding. If there are tasks that are not actually within the LMS that you need to do, you'll be able to, depending on how your business logic about putting them together, you should be able to report on those too. So basically, those are the examples that I wanted to show about how we can launch and access content anywhere. Again, it's basically through the set of statements that we put together. I'm sorry. Is this better? Okay, sounds good. Thank you. So, like I said, it's basically one of the things that we can do with the xAPI. It's the ability basically to launch and access content outside the LMS. We're not conformed to using SCORM objects only, SCORM packages. We can do so much more. So the fifth thing that, cool thing that you can do with xAPI is actually improving learners' experiences. What that means is basically, we're able to look at a history of what the learners are looking at or what they're doing from a learning perspective and judge. I think Ben talked about it a little bit, but specifically we can see, look at items, for example, how much time they're spending on a particular screen within the e-learning, how much time they're spending taking a quiz, that's hosted, outside the LMS. We can do all of that. And again, back to SCORM, some of the, other limitations. Basically, one of them is emphasis on the instruction and the assets in e-learning with a little thought about data or reporting. That's just, the structure or what's available to us with SCORM. Another, limitation with SCORM is the struggle to tie completions to performance and results. So what I was talking about earlier is through xAPI, you can actually tell when a person clicked on a button, how long it took a person to answer a set of questions. So, we can actually measure the effectiveness of the content, as I say. We can look at, data that is, going to be helpful to tell us how effective our the content that we're putting out there is, and we can go back and adjust, journeys. We can adjust the actual design of the content. Those are the types of things that we can do. So through the xAPI, basically behavior and results could be tied to learning through tracking of actions. Like I said, clicks are trackable. Everything is trackable. Even the time spent on particular items is trackable. The other aspect, from a learning standpoint, personalization and recommendations. Based on that history that we're putting together, I think Ben talked about how, from a machine learning experience, as time goes on, you're able to look at, a history or a log of things, or data points that can be trackable, and based on it, you can personalize and recommend. A big piece of the xAPI is, you can feed the statements and build business logic around them for our recommendations. So from a personalized journeys standpoint, like I said, based on learners' activity across systems, you can actually reward, you can intervene if the learner is taking too much time to finish a particular task. You can intervene and redirect the learner based on what you think is suitable for them to new pathways. An example of that is tracking if a new starter has checked into key office locations, update their intranet profile, for example, provided if they had provided bank details to HR, completed their induction module online. So these are all things that can be done and tracked. From a recommendations standpoint, again, it's all based on the data that you have. But you can keep your top talent employed and engaged through recommending new objects, new projects to them, collaborations, and understanding how their learning contributions correlate with key performance targets. So those are two examples of what could be done. There's another, cost element to it because, for example, if you find out that a learner has taken a particular, within their history, they've taken, compliance courses that they need to take once, and it's a new journey or a new pathway, you don't have to, based on their history, they don't have to retake that learning that they've already taken. You can basically give them a smaller set of questioning or quizzes to understand, to make sure that they're still knowing of the learning that they have to take. What this does is it's you're basically saving on training man hours, as an organization by taking on tactics as such.
Hytham, just a quick one. Can I just interject for 2 seconds?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
So just building on your point here, man. We had a conversation this morning here, and somebody's come up with a killer idea. So I'm going to give away the killer idea, and you guys can get trademark it or something like that. But like, there's a combination of using exactly what you're talking about here from the xAPI data. One of the things that we find we get that's quite effective if it's timed well is what we call a nudge, an email or something like that that's timed to people to get them to do something. But you come across things like compliance training or something, which I talked a bit about earlier, and like, how can you get people engaged in doing it? Well, if you were tracking when they were actually engaging in learning anyway, so like, I understand that this person has logged on and they've done N things, they're kind of in the flow of learning. then that's the exact moment when I want to send out a little notification that says, oh, by the way, whilst you're doing some learning, whilst you're doing something on the formal side, here's a notification that tells you you need to go and do that. So it's kind of, that's something that someone here at HT2 Labs had an idea this morning. It's like, that's a brilliant idea. If we can use the data to understand when somebody's in the flow of doing a particular activity and then nudge them to do something that they need to do or that we think is overdue or something like that when they're already doing it. Because it's such a pain in the ass, the sort of cost of switching tasks. If I'm in the middle of doing something else, I get an email and say, hey, you've got to do your compliance training to keep this up here or there. I'm like, that's getting snoozed. That's getting so snoozed. I can't even tell you how snoozed that's getting. But if I'm already in the flow, if I'm already in the LMS, if it looks like I'm doing a piece of learning and somebody can catch me at that moment and say, hey, look, whilst you're here, why not have a look at this? You kind of, you're a little bit late on it. That's killer, I think. So you're talking about earlier that, some of the guys on the call, they raised the sort of if this, then that, how can we move things along? I think that coupled with personalization, recommendation stuff, ideas like that come to life in an xAPI world.
Yep. All right. The final item that I wanted to talk about is basically the ability to infuse micro and social learning and gamification. What that does is, to a certain extent, it eliminates residual boredom, the residual boredom factor. We all know how boring e-learning can be sometimes. So I guess, through the xAPI, we are able, by incorporating gamification and interactivity, we're able to process, processes or have our learners go through processes like onboarding in an engaging and rewarding way to them. Examples of gamification is, examples are leaderboards, interactive videos, even goal-based point systems, reward programs. Those are all things that we can get rich data, coming from the interactions through statements, being sent to the LRS. For example, using xAPI in a game, we could depict how a learner got to a choice and give them immediate feedback. We can also, through the gamification, aspect of things, we can actually give them real-time results of how everyone else is doing. We can give them averages. We can give them more information about what they're going through. So, just to talk about the fourth thing, and I think actually that's the fifth thing. Sorry, that's my fault. So just the infusion of things like gamification, being able to actually make sense of some of the things that are happening, while the learners are trying those games or playing within those games. It's something that, xAPI can help an organization to, have that whole holistic experience for its learners. And let's see if there are any questions in here. I don't see anything. So that's.
Sorry, Hytham. You
want to get in touch with us? I'm sorry. Did you say something, Ben?
No, I was just seeing if there was any questions.
Okay.
April, can you talk about using this without LMS? Certainly. I mean, certainly, Hytham's point earlier, there's a WordPress option that they pursued before. We have a project that we're working towards right now that has a similar sort of output. A number of opportunities have come up for us to deploy xAPI without an LMS, and we have taken them. I'm going to go and find a blog link, actually. But Hytham, you got anything you want to add on that?
Sorry, say that again, Ben. I didn't hear you.
Sounds killing us, man. Sounds killing us. Anything on the question about the LMS you want to add? I'm just trying to find a link.
Yeah, I can go back to.
There you go. I got it. Oh. So, I mean, that blog is pretty much the same as what Hytham was explaining earlier about how you could use xAPI without an LMS. You can also do this without xAPI as well. So, you know, there's all sorts of possibilities here. But certainly, I'm seeing this as an exciting possibility to be able to deploy learning without the need for a learning management system, even formal stuff. I think there's a blog we wrote about it, and it's something we're doing increasingly now. Thanks, Dave.
Yeah. One point, you know, Melissa is saying that she doesn't use the xAPI with LMS. LMSs are the worst. You know, of course, LMSs, depending on which one, they all have their issues, and I guess at points they're clunky. But it's all about, I guess, the experience and how you know, structure and you know, build that experience for the learners. There are so many ways to get around it. I guess you know, this could be another discussion, but I totally understand where you're coming from, Melissa, and I've dealt with it, you know, but I think it's something that we could get around, basically. Are there any more questions?
Just asking Melissa there, through your content if you don't use LMS, Amazon S3. Yeah, I mean, that's probably what your LMS is going to store it in anyway at the end. You might as well just cut out the middle guy. But, you know, content management systems or anything like that can do it. The real problem that comes, in my experience, is how you deal with packages of content, because e-learning authoring tools are very used to putting out packages for an LMS. So if you don't have an LMS to launch and do things, that's where you can become a little bit unstuck. But I mean, you don't have to package it for anything specific. You can package it for the web, for xAPI, and you don't have to use packages of content. So, yeah, lots of options. I'm sure Melissa will be delighted to fill you in, Sam. Hi, guys.
Well, okay. All right. Well, thank you, guys. Thank you, Ben, for your time. And if you have any questions, you know, our emails on the screen, email addresses are on the screen. So feel free to get in touch with us and you know, get ideas. So thank you.